FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
Well, Clarence Thomas is the most conservative justice now on the Supreme Court, and as Scalia will tell you, he has much less regard for precedent, for settled cases. If a case is wrong, Clarence Thomas thinks on the law, the court should relook at it. Whereas Scalia is much more willing to respect precedent. He's much less likely to overturn earlier cases. They frequently vote together. As you know, just like Ginsburg and Stevens frequently vote together. But when Thomas first joined the court, literally in his first week, his first conference, he was willing to stand alone on a number, particularly on the criminal cases. It's fascinating to look in the notes and the documents because, you know, the justices, when they sit down to vote on cases, they go in this room, a private, ornately paneled conference room, and everything in the court's done by seniority, even the way they go into the courtroom. You know, the Chief Justice goes in first, and then the most senior, and the next, all the way down. They go in line. Even when they walked out of the courtroom for Rehnquist's funeral, they all went in order of seniority. So they're sitting around this conference table to vote. No one else can come in. It's only the justices. And that's done, of course, by seniority, too. So the Chief Justice starts off that conversation. He says what he thinks about the case, and then he says, you know, I will vote to affirm, which means let the lower court decision stand. This was in Thomas's first conference, by the way. The next justice says affirm. The next says affirm, affirm, affirm. It gets to Thomas, and in his very first conference, he said affirm. The case was going to be 9-0. It was a criminal case. A state was trying to keep a convicted criminal in a mental institution, and he was trying to get out. So the justices, 9-0, all sided with the criminal and against the state. Thomas couldn't sleep that night. He felt like he had capitulated to the power of, you know, the group thinking. He went back and talked to Rehnquist the next day. He said, I'm changing my vote. I feel that the state government's arguments were right. And so he wrote his dissent. It was going to be 8-1. And he circulated around, which is how the justices do. They'll write their opinions, and then they pass them all around to the chambers. And when Rehnquist and Scalia and Kennedy saw Thomas's dissent, they all changed their votes too. So that case ended up being 5-4. And that happened many times that term. Even a case where the New York Times had infamously called Thomas the youngest, cruelest justice. It involved a prison inmate who was beaten by guards. And the prisoner was suing under the 8th Amendment, prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. That case, again, in the conference, it went around the table. Everyone sided with the prison inmate until it got to Thomas. And he said, no, this is not cruel and unusual punishment. There are a lot of different ways that this inmate can sue, but punishment is, you know, you go to prison or you're being, you know, those are the punishments. This is something else. And so he circulated that dissent, and that dissent, when it hit Scalia's desk, Scalia changed his vote. That case ended up being 7-2. One of the interesting things about Thomas's arrival on the court that year, and I think a perfect illustration of how it really turned upside down the chessboard, Thomas came on, remember, it was late. It was in November because we had the Anita Hill hearings, and that took up the first month of October. So he missed a lot of arguments, including 2 that had divided the court 4-4. You know, with him off the bench, there were only 8 justices. They were waiting for the next justice. So when that happens, those cases get re-argued. The lawyers come back, they present their case again, and then typically the new guy casts the deciding vote. That's what happened when Justice Kennedy joined the court. He cast the deciding vote in 4 of the cases that had split the justices 4-4. They'd end up 5-4. So, and the same this year with Justice Alito. He ended up casting the tie vote. But when Thomas joined the court that year, those 2 cases were re-argued for him. Again, splitting the court 4-4. He comes on, they're re-argued, and in both cases, Thomas ended up in dissent because his being on the court, those arguments, the differences in the arguments caused other justices, Souter and O'Connor in particular, to rethink their positions. So they changed their votes, and Thomas ended up, instead of casting the deciding vote, he ended up being the dissenting vote in both of those cases. And the fascinating thing, again, about Thomas, I think, is why the storyline for so long was that he was just following Scalia, or he wasn't that smart, or, you know, all the things that people wrote about Thomas at the time, all of which are false. We did a pretty provocative piece for Nightline last week when I talked to a lot of Justice Thomas's supporters and very staunch opponents, and also Julian Bond, the great civil rights leader. And it was fascinating because they said, all of them, Bond, opponents, proponents, thought that, you know, there obviously is some kind of racial subtext to that why that would be the storyline when there's certainly no evidence of it. Julian Bond said, you know, I've always thought Clarence Thomas was a smart guy. You know, you don't get where you've gotten without being a smart guy. I don't have a problem with his abilities. It's his opinions. You know, why don't we talk about his opinions? You know, and this is what this is what that would do and that would do. So I think that was probably, of all, you know, the research I did, the most surprising to me. And I think, you know, it's something that it's time now. Let's talk about Thomas's opinions, because he has a lot to say. A lot of people aren't going to agree with it, but, you know, it's things that are worth debating.